You are listening to episode 13 of the Casual Historian podcast. In this episode, James and I review the film Denial and talk about Holocaust deniers. If you enjoy this podcast, then I would encourage you to leave a rating and review on iTunes or on any podcasting service with a similar feature. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, you can reach us at casualhistorian@gmail.com or leave a comment on the website casualhistorian.com. But for now, enjoy the episode. Alright, think how to start this. That's usually how I start every single episode, is by asking how to start this.
Once upon a time, in a far-off kingdom, there lived a fair maiden, a sad young lad, and a childless baker with his wife. I wish, more than anything, more than life, more than jewels, more than the moon. What? Sometimes a great way to start.
I'll start this way we always do. How's your week been?
Well, the Brits just officially checked the box into oblivion. I mean, Brexit was a formal notification going out this last week. And I think that the reply from the president of the European Council was very nice, and his closing sentence was kind of poignant. We already miss you. Goodbye and thank you.
Since you mention Brexit, it's a perfect segue to our topic for today, which is a film about a historical event that takes place in Britain. But this isn't like other historical films. Most historical films we get, they're about a soldier, a politician, or sometimes about an artist or a scientist. These are the stories that historians write about. But you never get movies about historical events that are about historians. It's almost like, it's kind of meta in a way. Well, the movie James and I just watched is Denial, based on the book Holocaust History on Trial by Deborah Lipstadt, who is a Jewish American historian, specializes in the Holocaust. And the movie tells the story about how she was sued for libel by a British Holocaust denier, which is where the perfect segue comes in.
Yes, it's about things that involve British people. The film was, first of all, a BBC production, which was very high quality and very well performed. And I think that in a lot of ways, because of the sheer density of the subject matter, it could easily have just been produced as a documentary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But by making the choice to do it as a traditional film, it really helped to humanize what was going on. And from a historiographical standpoint, it raises important questions, not about the Holocaust in general, but it talks about really about the question of how do we prove historical events? How do we know that things happened? The Holocaust is just one of those things that is so big and so the impact of its place in history still reverberates decades later, that you find yourself thinking, why on earth would anyone actually question this? I think there's a point was made in the film that people can question, question the motives, question, the process by which it took place, question its impact, but to question whether it happened or not is an unacceptable thing, and I think that that's a very important point. For those who have not seen the film or read the book or even followed the court case that took place in the late 90s and early 2000s. Professor Lipstadt, as Grant mentioned, is a Jewish American historian, and she actually really focuses on exploring why people deny the validity of the Holocaust. And she ends up being sued by this fellow
Irving.
Yeah, I forgot it for a second. I forgot his name. David Irving. And Irving is a one-time legit historian who ended up basically trading his legitimacy away, chasing this fantasy that not either the Holocaust didn't happen, or if it did, Hitler did not sanction it or try to stop it. And it really seems to be a bit all over the place in terms of what his mission is. Like, the Holocaust didn't happen, but if it did, it didn't. He ends up suing Professor Lipstadt for libel in the High Court of England. And the thing about libel cases in the UK is that the burden of proof is actually shifted onto the defendant, and that the approach for libel there is that the defendant has to prove that what they said was accurate. Whereas in America, libel law requires the plaintiff to articulate how the libel, one, was untrue, and two, that it actually created an impact or had harm. In the UK, it's a bit different. So what ends up happening is a civil court, ends up becoming a bit of a trial room for whether or not the Holocaust itself took place. And so we see over the course of it that historians, experts are brought in to present documented evidence as to why we know the Holocaust happened. But it did also raise an issue that I'm not sure if it has been addressed since, but that for numerous reasons, probably like the international political situation immediately after World War II, at no point has for the camps like Auschwitz or others like Dachau or others, has there been an actual attempt to go through and forensically examine what took place? And it's a very visceral thing because on the one hand, the camps are crime scenes. They're the scenes of the greatest crimes against humanity ever. But on the other hand, they're also graves. They're memorials. In many ways, it's sacred ground. So it verges on some important questions, but I'm just going to throw this out there too, just a side note. Holocaust deniers are gross. I don't like you. If you're listening, please don't listen anymore, because I have nothing nice to say to you. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I remember I read a bit of the book the movie was based on before watching the film. And there was part of something that just sort of kept bugging me about the whole concept. She talked about in the film and in the book that she will not talk with a Holocaust denier. And on the surface level, it's like, yeah, of course, you don't want to talk about someone who denies this terrible thing happened. But then there's just another small part in the back of my head that just keeps saying, but an academic, you should be allowed to pursue any line of questioning you want. So there's these two ideas of an academics, you have to be able to question anything you want. But then again, is there a line past which you don't question anymore?
Yeah, I think that's actually a big part of this. And there's a bit more exploration, not so much in the film, but exploration of it elsewhere, that Irving himself was guilty of basically several fallacies in reasoning when it comes to his attacks on the Holocaust itself. And something that I also might add is that when it comes to evidence in history, I guess you might say that in many respects, when we look at something and say, all right, is it historical fact or not? That there is an element of it's an aggregation of evidence. Details may be incorrect and may change over time, but an aggregation of evidence presented is really what underpins our understanding of history. Now, what Irving was arguing was Irving would take accounts from troops, accounts from survivors, and he would just find tiny holes to prick in them. And his goal was, if he would prick holes in them, he would raise doubt, which would then cast doubt on the entirety of whether the Holocaust took place or not. But that's not how consensus works in history. It's not even how consensus works scientifically. History is formally a science. So what we're responding to, sorry, your point about, is there a point at which point you don't question anymore, is that there is an evidentiary standard that does point to the Holocaust taking place. There is documentation. No, there aren't photographs of the atrocities themselves, such as the chambers or the incinerations. But what we do have are the documented photographs of the survivors of the camps, their experiences, photographs of the horrifying and appalling conditions in which they were kept. The other thing, too, is that when we're dealing with historical debate, when we're raising questions, usually there's an agreed upon set of rules that once, a sufficient amount of evidence or persuasive evidence is there, when there's a consensus, then all right. But what Irving was trying to do was, Irving was a person who would move the goalposts. His goal was to cast doubt, as though doubt about an aspect of the Holocaust would negate the entire thing. That's not how it worked, and not how it ever works. And I think it's in many ways similar to people who, like the thought processes of people who deny the Holocaust are not different from people who deny things like American slavery, or people who deny the roundness of the earth, as another example. There's plenty of evidence there, but inaccuracies in one aspect or other they will use to try to shoot down the reality of those facts.
Yeah. Though a difference I find between sort of people who tried to deny slavery versus those who tried to deny the Holocaust is that there aren't nearly as many people who tried to deny the existence of chattel slavery in the United States as there are people who have tried to deny the Holocaust. In fact, today, something that Professor Lipstadt brought up in the book is that why she decided to write about Holocaust denial in the first place is because that she is actually afraid that this would become more prominent over time as we get further away from the Holocaust and as certain places around the world find it politically advantageous to endorse such a set of ideas, that it would become more powerful. And she's absolutely right on that. The fact that pretty much every government in, say, the Middle East, the Holocaust denial is sort of state policy. It's state belief. It's like the only place in the Middle East that doesn't have that is Israel at the moment.
I think that, especially in the Western world, because the Holocaust was a Western crime. It was a crime of Western civilization. And the varying responses to it in certain places has been very, very charged. In, for example, Germany and Austria, it's actually a criminal offense to deny the Holocaust. And in fact, Irving apparently was sentenced in absentia for denying the Holocaust in Austria. Interestingly enough, Professor Lipstadt said that she opposed his sentencing because she considered it to be an abrogation of free speech. But she is absolutely right that there are times when it becomes an en vogue, fashionable thing to sometimes, question the Holocaust. It's edgy or some ridiculous nonsense like that. But there's something I have to say. For people who might raise questions about the impact or the causes of the Holocaust, those are valid historical questions to ask. That many people do. But I'm going to say, I have not yet met or encountered or read of a Holocaust denier who is not, in fact, an anti-Semite.
Yeah, that's another, it's a little thing I was, while reading the book, watching the film, my head was going through the scenes. Like the other question that was in the back of my head before, at what point do you stop following a line of questioning? At what point do you have to agree with the consensus? Another thought was going through my head is that denial in and of itself, just black and white objectivist thought, Holocaust denial doesn't have to be, it's not inherently anti-Semitic, but I have never met a Holocaust denier who was not an anti-Semite. So it's this weird thing. It's not inherent, but you can't find any others there. It's the kind of thing that it's the kind of academic idea. I'm not even sure if I should call it academic.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
It's not rooted in evidentiary thinking. It's not rooted in a forensic examination of what exists.
Yeah. It's the kind of idea that it's naturally going to attract people like that. So, and from my brain just couldn't help but think, objectively speaking, they are not inherently the same. They're not inherently mutually exclusive, but in practice they are. Like, say, communism and oppression of human rights. In theory, they don't have to happen, but they always do.
Well, what I would note in terms of anti-Semitism and Holocaust deniers, that you're very absolutely correct that the very notion of Holocaust denial is one that's very attractive to certain anti-Semites. Horrifyingly enough, there are anti-Semites who not only accept the Holocaust took place, they
praise.
Yeah, God, those people. It's really hard for me to figure out which is worse in many ways. But there are strains of anti-Semitic thought and anti-Semitic apologists who are especially drawn to Holocaust denial. And it is, well, I'm not sure that I can necessarily say that universally there's causation one way or the other, but there is a definite correlation. In much the same way that denial of slavery in the Americas is usually linked with white supremacy.
Yeah.
And it's because it is meant to, what it does is it caters to and validates a particular worldview that treats an ethnic difference as one that merits subjugation or extermination. Or by denying that these events, Holocaust, the slavery, etc., took place, it absolves society of its failure to act to prevent these atrocities from taking place. And I think that's really, in many reasons, why denial, especially the Holocaust, why it's so dangerous. Because it means that by denying it, it means that it didn't take place, which means that people don't need to learn the lessons. People don't need to understand that the world as a whole failed to prevent it.
Yes, and I'd say that's, just to get slightly off topic, it's slightly political, but it's the Holocaust has become, of course, the ultimate justification for any kind of violence in the name of preventing a bad thing from happening. It's this idea, we have to stop the next Hitler. And it's and that seems to be a lot of people's justifications on both the left and the right all around the world, and the United States, especially recently, where it's like, well, if you can stop the next Hitler, you are among the righteous of the nations.
Yeah, well, I mean, the fact of the matter is that this is a really big debatable issue because, of course, intervention can be a very, very difficult thing. Foreign intervention in another nation can be a very difficult thing to articulate or justify. And honestly, part of the problem is that the West's track record in intervention has been so spotty. In the 1990s and early 2000s, the West intervened successfully to prevent genocide in Bosnia and in Kosovo. But while they did so, they failed to really act effectively in places like Rwanda and Burundi, failed to act in Uganda, failed to act in southern Sudan. And then when there was the next attempt at intervention, Iraq, well... And of course, Iraq was not spun or justified as intervention to prevent a genocide. It was a barrage of things. And then certainly the Kurds were an oppressed group in Iraq, but it is not clear as yet that the Iraqi government intended genocide on the level to which the Serbs in the 90s or the Germans in the 1930s and 40s aspired.
Yeah. Right. Well, so I'm gonna drag the conversation away from that little tangent and back to the film itself. And it's like you didn't get a chance to do too much reading up on the story before. I saw you on your phone Wikipediaing, I'm assuming, different characters or elements of the case or whatever. And I want to point out some of the things that are sort of a difference between the book and the film.
Or in this case, between what actually happened and the film.
Yeah, well, again, I don't know, because there are a number of things that aren't talked about in the book directly. You know, she doesn't give a direct... Lipstadt doesn't give a direct description of how every conversation she had with these different people involved in the case transpired in the book. Mm-hmm. So it's like one of the things that came up in the film was Deborah Lipstadt in the film wanted to bring Holocaust survivors to the trial and have them, you know, give testimony. Now, at least that's how it's done in the film. But in the film, her lawyers tell her, no, we don't want to bring Holocaust deniers in because David Irving is going to take glee in embarrassing them and making them relive their tragedy. Now, in the film, Deborah Lipstadt is very against this notion of not letting them speak for themselves. And she makes a big fuss about it for a good chunk of the film. But in the book, she describes that she was pretty much on board with that the entire time. She was on board with that idea. And as well as in the film, she gets angry that she can't speak in trial. And granted, in the book, she mentions her annoyance with that. But once again, the entire time she was on board with it. She understood why they wanted to do the things they wanted to do. So it seems like for the film, for the purpose of creating drama, they needed to fudge some details of it, you know, and these are the kind of things you find in any kind of courtroom drama put into film, you know,
or a historical topic put into film. In this case, you combine them and
yeah, so they had to create drama somewhere, and so they had to fudge some of these details. But the other thing about the film I want to bring up is the fact that this is a film about historians, a historical film about historians. You don't see that. And I would actually like to see more things like this, but unfortunately I just have to think, are the lives of any historians interesting enough to make movies about them?
Well, I think that's a good point. You know, really, I don't think most people would find the ordinary life of an academic pouring through archives or, you know, libraries to be all that exciting. I would find it exciting to do. Even I have to admit, I might not find it that exciting to watch.
Yeah.
I think that, you know, even in things like, say, archaeology, you know, the way we approach archaeology isn't, you know, really... Archaeology in cinema is not a reflection of what archaeology actually is. We get Lara Croft and Indiana Jones, and you know, paleontology. We get, you know, Jurassic Park.
Yes,
where you go from a dig site to a park full of dinosaur clones trying to eat you. I think it's just one of those things with the way that Hollywood works. Well, not even just Hollywood, even television. The way things work is that people want something to interest them. They want a hook, and, you know, uncovering, you know, what happened to the two twins that Richard locked in the Tower of London might not be that interesting of a subject matter.
Yeah, though I say they can do movies about academics, but there has to be a shtick. What movie was it they made about Stephen Hawking, a younger Stephen Hawking before the robotization, for lack of better words?
Before his disability.
Yeah, before his disability kicked in. And so they can make movies about him, but they have to have something like that. It's like, oh, Stephen Hawking's, he's publicly notable. He is, you know, you mention him, people know who he is. If nothing else they know about him, they know that, oh, he's the guy who sounds like a speak and spell.
Oh, God. Okay. Anyway, but you are correct in that a public figure, someone who's already known, to the wider public will have a much better time having such a film made, and fictional historians might not be really dragged up either, except for God, what is that? The Da Vinci Code series. I think that's about a historian. That's not a good example.
I think he's a symbologist or whatever he calls himself.
That's not a thing. But anyway, yeah.
It's Tom Hanks. He can be whatever he wants.
And part of the problem in terms of academic historians is that, we don't have really many academic historians that are known outside of their fields. And if they are, it's probably not very far out. It might be in a neighboring cousin academic field, like say politics or economics, and or even sometimes like things like art or literature, but we don't have a current historian that's just so well known. I mean, I don't think I would necessarily oppose a movie about, say, Herodotus, following him on his journey. That could be a very interesting type of epic, but
that would require something like the History Channel would do a mini series about that if they could add him into the battles that he wasn't there for.
And knowing the History Channel as it is now, they'd somehow be in World War II.
Well, it would be that super highly stylized type of film that they've gotten into recently. But yeah, so let's talk about your fascination with the first lawyer Deborah came in contact with, Anthony.
Oh, well, it just so happens that, I can't remember the name of the actor offhand, but he is Anthony Julius is the solicitor who represents Deborah Lipstadt, and he was also the same lawyer who represented the late Princess of Wales, Diana, in her divorce from Charles. And it was a very interesting, doubly interesting thing for me because, one, I'm an Anglophile. But it was also funny because the actor who plays him, and I can't remember the name of the actor, also plays Moriarty in the BBC series Sherlock. So I kept thinking at some points, is this what he did before he became Moriarty? He was an awesome solicitor and barrister. But I would also recommend the film also to American audiences, not merely because of the subject matter, but it also presents an interesting look at a different legal system from ours. Because you may have heard me use the word solicitor earlier. In America, we have lawyers. Just lawyers. In the United Kingdom and in many of the Commonwealth realms, the profession that we call lawyer is actually divided into two. Into what are barristers, who are those who actually function in trial, who speak in the court, and solicitors, who basically manage legal affairs outside of that, and they're very specialized. Now, you could question whether or not having just the one job as we do is better, or having the two specialized ones is better. It was actually very interesting to see how the relationship between the barrister and the solicitor played off in this film, in that relationship as part of a larger legal team.
Yeah. It was definitely a bit odd coming from the American's perspective, especially in the trailer. They put a lot of emphasis on, wait a minute, you mean there's not a presumption of innocence? It's going to just favor the guy who's suing me, which granted was a big theme in the film, but you have to wonder, was that as big of a deal in the trial as the film made it out to be?
Well, it's certainly probably one of those types of things that is very jarring to an American. And I might add that in terms of UK law, that in most matters, and certainly in criminal matters, the presumption of innocence is still there. It is merely that they approach libel from a different standpoint, because it's not a criminal matter. It's a civil matter. So as here, a civil matter doesn't require beyond a reasonable doubt probation. It requires preponderance of the evidence as a standard, and it's somewhat similar there. It's just that for some reason, if I sue you for libel, you have to be able to prove what you said was true. rather than my job, which is having to prove what we would say is untrue, which in some ways philosophically makes sense because you can't prove a negative. So that might explain why the burden is somewhat shifted, and also why in the U.S. things like libel and slander cases are very, very rare because of the fact that they rest. Well, the presumption of innocence is important. It also rests upon the need to prove a negative.
Yeah. So in the book, they made some emphasis on this, and the film starts with a fictional event that didn't occur. At least Deborah Lipstadt did not depict this event in her book, and I'm going to guess that it didn't actually happen. It's about 1994. She's giving a lecture at a college on Holocaust denial. She gets a question from someone in the audience about, why are you degrading the work of David Irving? She goes on to explain, like, I'm not degrading him. I'm not addressing him at all. And then suddenly David Irving is in the audience, stands up, and you notice just before this occurs, as you see a person walking into the room, someone sets up a camera. Clearly they were setting something up for the scene. But of course, as these white supremacists who are following David Irving around are setting up for a sting, this entire scene is a setup. It didn't occur, and it was definitely very good trailer bait. That seems like the entire reason for this scene was trailer bait.
Well, I don't think it's merely trailer bait. I think it was also meant to, from a storytelling perspective, it create an initial confrontation between the two of them, which. From a storytelling standpoint, makes sense to have that initial storytelling. It presents Professor Lipstadt in her role as the firm, principled protagonist. It presents Irving clearly from the outset as an underhanded, sly, manipulative demagogue, as far as it taking place in reality or not, it probably did not. You probably have to do a lot of digging to see if that ever actually happened. But it does seem a very odd thing to do for, someone to travel across the Atlantic just to turn up in a lecture hall, just to an offer to give $1,000 away to someone who can prove to him that the Holocaust existed, which, by the way, is a trap, because when you're trying to debate the Holocaust with Holocaust deniers, you will never win because there is no evidentiary standard that they will hold themselves to.
Yes, I would describe it as being very legalistic. The same way, they deny the Holocaust the same way, the Turks might deny the Armenian genocide. There's no written order that it happened, therefore it didn't.
Right. Well, and the thing is, there's a slight difference is in that Turks acknowledge that many Armenians were killed during the First World War. The Turkish government just has an allergy to acknowledging that was genocide and refuses to use the word genocide. They accept that Armenians were killed en masse, but they won't use the word genocide to describe it, which is baffling and hypocritical. Holocaust deniers will deny even that there were deaths. I think there was a clip that was used, which I think is based on a real clip, where he claims that more people died in the back of Senator Kennedy's car than died in Auschwitz. Arguing that not a single person ever died, and that's horrifyingly monstrous, because it's not legalistic. If it's a legalistic argument, a legalistic person will understand that there are criteria that you have to meet, and once those are met, they'd accept it. The evidence for the Holocaust is there; it's preponderant, but they still refuse to accept it, and it's because they will use a double standard of evidence for the Holocaust they won't use for other historical events. We have a lot more evidence that the Holocaust existed now than we have evidence for things like the fall of Babylon to the Persian Empire or anything earlier than that, where we're dealing with perhaps single historical records that could have been edited who knows how many ways.
A fun piece of background, once again, covered in the book. The first several chapters of the book are covering, they form a semi-autobiography of Lipstadt herself, as well as some of Irving's career, because they don't go over much of Irving's career before this event occurred, other than just saying
it's very, very briefly touched on that he has some reputation with military historians, and that was about it.
Yeah, and so for Irving, it's just very interesting that the first book that made him famous has been highly regarded, at least until these events, hence this trial occurred. You know, his criticisms of the bombings of Dresden have definitely, I think, struck a chord with people. And even if his work on it itself has not been retained by most scholars, he sort of began a big movement of criticizing the Allies' conduct of World War II that continues in some straits to this day.
Well, yeah, his initial work, and actually the film calls attention to something of this in another point, but he did levy a great deal of criticism at the American and British forces responsible for the carpet bombing of German cities during the late stages of the war, into which refugees were fleeing. Certainly these were crimes against humanity and violations of the Geneva Conventions, most assuredly. The trouble with Irving, and the point is made in the film, is that there came a point where he went from a person who accepted the Holocaust, was real and it happened, to someone who did not. As was pointed out in a major change of editions between his two books, his book Hitler's War, which in an initial edition clearly presented the Holocaust as an integral part of Germany's behavior during World War II, and a later edition in which all reference to it at all were redacted.
Yeah, and another piece from the book is that this libel trial that the film depicts is not the first libel trial that Irving was involved with. Lipstadt was not the first person he sued for libel.
Oh.
And actually, he had been sued for libel a couple times before that.
But how did those go?
He lost.
Good.
All of them.
Good. This makes me happy.
Yes, and there was that whole thing in Canada where he was banned.
Yeah, he in the early 1990s, I think it was 1992, he was named persona non grata in Canada. He was sentenced to 3 years of prison in Austria at a later point, as I've mentioned. So just to touch on this, because this is one thing the film plays up, is the feeling of uncertainty that Professor Lipstadt, our protagonist, has as to whether or not there'll be a positive outcome of this trial or not. And we see her, assembling the legal team, raising funds to pay for it. But if Lipstadt had been aware, as she almost certainly was, that he'd been in all of these trials, she probably would have been a bit more confident in the outcome.
Yes. In the book, she is definitely portrayed as being more confident. What she was afraid of in the book was not that Irving was going to win, but that the trial was going to turn into, trying to prove whether or not the Holocaust happened.
Which it basically kind of did.
Kind of, yeah. Yeah. They finally got the point towards the end that, yes, Irving has misrepresented historical evidence to support a political view of his own, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, it's very, I guess, in a trial like this, it would be very difficult to tell the difference between putting the evidence of the Holocaust on trial versus putting this man whose career has been made of putting Holocaust evidence to question. It's kind of hard to separate those two entirely.
Right. And one of the things is that the approach it's taken is to bombard the court with facts about the Holocaust and then display how Irving's attempts to undermine or even just call into question the validity of that evidence demonstrated his predisposition and distortion of the facts.
one last funny moment from the book, from where at least where I am in the book right now, it's that before the trial even started, there was a filmmaker in the United States who had talked to her and wanted to buy the rights to her story about this trial, which hadn't even occurred yet.
Oh, well.
People wanted to make a movie about
90s,
this
before
it even happened.
Yeah, well, it's definitely very 90s production company type thing. I have one last question for you.
Yep.
As we were watching this movie, we got some nice establishing shots of Rachel Weisz, who plays Professor Lipshot in her home. She has a dog, a border collie, who is an adorable Bork. I immediately declared that the Bork was my favorite character of the movie. Eventually, actually got demoted to second favorite character in the movie about midway through. Actually, not even midway. It was like maybe a quarter of the way through. Yeah. But is the dog in the book at all?
No, I'm afraid the dog is not mentioned in the book.
It's very unfortunate because I like the dog.
Yeah, though the book does spend a little more time talking about how she got the money for the case.
Yeah, that was actually a very interesting. I want to jump onto that real quick. The film portrays a scene where she is in London, and she is having dinner with several members of the Jewish community in the UK or in London. It's not really clear specifically which was just Londoners or if it was for the entire United Kingdom. And they're of course aware of the case, and they actually are telling her to settle. Because I take it they're afraid that the trial would give Irving a platform or another platform if he'd been bringing these libel trials before, and how that really does not jive with her. Does the book present any kind of corroboration of that version of events, or
it does present some, like the Jewish and the European Jews, mostly talking about the British ones, they were more in favor of settling, mostly because, well, I can't exactly say why, but most of them just did it. I think for most of them it was they don't want to give Irving a platform with which to spread more of his, Holocaust denial propaganda. The American Jews were very supportive of her efforts, and in fact, there's almost semi-conspiratorial in that when she was raising money for her defense, she initially wasn't going out to actively get money. Like the university she worked for or gave her about like $25,000 for defense, and then Penguin put up some money as well.
Well, they were also named defendants in the suit. So.
Yeah. Though Penguin was actually contemplated dropping her case because there's a part in her contract with Penguin for publishing her book, denying the Holocaust, and that is if any of her works would bring up a legal suit, that Penguin would have the right to abandon all responsibility for her.
Well, it's good they didn't, because that honestly, had they, beyond the morals of it, it would have been a public relations catastrophe had they done so.
Yeah. And anyways, back to the money raising. When she went out to raise money, she made sure to raise money very, very quietly. She went to many of these different Jewish organizations, and she didn't want any of these Jewish organizations to actually donate money to her directly because that would get a lot of public and international attention. She wanted her fundraising to be secret so that Irving and his groups and his ilk would not find out about how much in terms of resources she had at her disposal. Which is somewhat surprising, at least with the film. I haven't gotten to the trial part in the book itself. But in the trial, it's very surprising how well Irving was able to stand up on his own when he was working by himself. That it took this team of lawyers and paralegals to overcome some of his arguments, which is just, not to praise Irving, but just from a purely debate standpoint, it's like, wow, that's pretty well done when he managed to overcome an entire team for a little bit by himself.
Yeah, it's clear, however, that didn't really hold very long. And I think that one of the more telling moments of the film is how easily wrong-footed he is at several points. And again, the book will probably have more insight on that, but how easily rattled he was, how easily off-put he was when holes are poked in his own arguments. There's one point where he argues that the chambers in Auschwitz were used as air raid shelters, as well for the SS when their barracks were 2.5 miles away. He argued that they were used also to gas the bodies of the already deceased who were yet to be incinerated. And the barrister asks the pointed question: what is the point of gassing bodies that are already dead, that are going to be incinerated? And he doesn't have the ability to respond to those.
Yeah.
But yeah, I really do think that this is a significant film in a lot of ways. It was very much under the radar in some respects, but I think it's one that's significant not only because of it tackling an issue that it has become edgy to make light of in recent years. I remember it's really interesting. Like, it's just a simple moment in the film when she visits Auschwitz and she is stepping onto the demolished ruins of one of the crematoria, and there's no score. There's not a whole lot of dialogue going on, but it is something that is just so viscerally painful to watch and to feel. And it's like the saying that lest we forget, this is something that we have to remember as a massive tragedy in human terms, that we cannot forget, and that we really, as a society, while free speech is important, people have the ability to express their opinions. We also have an opinion to use our free speech to respond to them.
Yes. The ultimate message of the film, I think it needs to be, you have the right to freedom of speech, but you don't have the right from people calling you out on what you say.
Right. You don't freedom, because freedom of speech applies to everyone. And then if you want to go and say the Holocaust didn't happen, at least in the United States and the United Kingdom, you have the right to do so. And you can expect that people will use their freedom of speech to set you straight.
Yeah. So I think that's a good message to leave out on for this episode. So thank you for watching that movie with me.
It was a very, very good film, in spite of my very angry shouting at the screen on occasion.
Oh, I just love seeing your reactions to just things. Yeah, that was my entertaining part. But
yeah, I guess we can do a James Reacts video for it at some point.
Yeah. Who knows? Maybe we'll come up with a video series, history, science, theater.
I like that idea. If we can, get away with it with fair use stuff,
Yep. We'll look into it. Well, till next time.
All right, signing off.
Yep. Testing. All right, that's good. All right, make a sound. All right, that's. Well, that's more for me to edit out.
Please don't use this in the opening.
All right.
Okay. That's out of my system, I think. Stealer.
Alrighty.
Are we having a poetry reading? Is that what the drumming was for?
Da 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 da. I don't know a poem, but this is my stereotypical beatnik cadences.
I'm pretty sure that this might qualify as post poetry.
What, beatnik stuff?
No, what you just did, whatever that was.
Art is subjective. All right.